The Emancipation Proclamation was a presidential proclamation, an executive order issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863. In a single stroke, it changed the federal legal status of more than 3 million enslaved persons in the designated areas of the South from slave to free. It had the practical effect that as soon as a slave escaped the control of the Confederate government, by running away or through advances of federal troops, the slave became legally free. Eventually it reached and liberated all of the designated slaves. It was issued as a war measure during the American Civil War, directed to all of the areas in rebellion and all segments of the executive branch of the United States. It proclaimed the freedom of slaves in the 10 states that were still in rebellion. Because it was issued under the president's war powers, it necessarily excluded areas not in rebellion. It applied to more than 3 million of the 4 million slaves in the U.S. at the time. The proclamation was based on the president's constitutional authority as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. It was not a law passed by Congress. The proclamation also ordered that suitable persons among those freed could be enrolled into the paid service of United States forces, and ordered the Union Army to recognize and maintain the freedom of the ex-slaves. The proclamation did not compensate the owners, did not outlaw slavery, and did not grant citizenship to the ex-slaves. It made the eradication of slavery an explicit war goal, in addition to the goal of reuniting the Union. Around 20,000 to 50,000 slaves in regions where rebellion had already been subdued were immediately emancipated. It could not be enforced in areas still under rebellion, but as the Union Army took control of Confederate regions, the proclamation provided the legal framework for freeing more than 3 million slaves in those regions. Prior to the proclamation, in accordance with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, escaped slaves were either returned to their masters or held in camps as contraband for later return. The proclamation applied only to slaves in Confederate-held lands. It did not apply to those in the 4 slave states that were not in rebellion, nor to Tennessee and Lower Louisiana, and specifically excluded those counties of Virginia soon to form the state of West Virginia. Also specifically excluded were some regions already controlled by the Union Army. Emancipation in those places would come after separate state actions or the December 1865 ratification of the 13th Amendment, which made slavery an indentured servitude, except for those duly convicted of a crime, illegal everywhere subject to United States jurisdiction. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln had issued a preliminary proclamation warning that he would order the emancipation of all slaves in any state that did not end its rebellion against the Union by January 1, 1863. None of the Confederate states restored themselves to the Union, and Lincoln's order, signed and issued January 1, 1863, took effect. The Emancipation Proclamation outraged white Southerners who envisioned a race war, angered some Northern Democrats, energized anti-slavery forces, and undermined forces in Europe that wanted to intervene to help the Confederacy. The proclamation lifted the spirits of African Americans, both free and slave. It led many slaves to escape from their masters and get to Union lines to obtain their freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation broadened the goals of the Civil War. While slavery had been a major issue that led to the war, Lincoln's only mission at the start of the war was to maintain the Union. The proclamation made freeing the slaves an explicit goal of the Union war effort, establishing the abolition of slavery as one of the 2 primary war goals served to deter intervention by Britain and France. The Emancipation Proclamation was never challenged in court. To ensure the abolition of slavery in all of the U.S., Lincoln pushed for passage of the 13th Amendment. Congress passed it by the necessary 2/3 vote on January 31, 1865, and it was ratified by the states on December 6, 1865. Authority. The United States Constitution of 1787 did not use the word slavery, but included several provisions about unfree persons. The Three-Fifths Compromise allocated congressional representation based on the whole number of free persons, and three-fifths of all other persons. Under the Fugitive Slave Clause, no person held to service or labor in one state would be freed by escaping to be another. Article 1, Section 9 allowed Congress to pass legislation to outlaw the importation of persons, but not until 1808. However, for purposes of the Fifth Amendment, which states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law, slaves were understood as property. Although abolitionists used the Fifth Amendment to argue against slavery, it became part of the legal basis for treating slaves as property with Dred Scott v. Sandford. Socially, slavery was also supported in law and in practice by a pervasive culture of white supremacy. Nonetheless, between 1777 and 1804, every northern state provided for the immediate or gradual abolition of slavery. No southern state did so, and the slave population of the South continued to grow. Lincoln understood that the federal government's power to end slavery in peacetime was limited by the Constitution, which before 1865 committed the issue to individual states. Against the background of the American Civil War, however, Lincoln issued the proclamation under his authority as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, under Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. As such, he claimed to have the martial power to free persons held as slaves in those states that were in rebellion, as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion. He did not have commander-in-chief authority over the four slave-holding states that were not in rebellion: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland and Delaware, and so those states were not named in the proclamation. The fifth border jurisdiction, West Virginia, where slavery remained legal but was in the process of being abolished, was, in January 1863, still part of the legally recognized, reorganized, state of Virginia, based in Alexandria, which was in the Union. Coverage. The proclamation applied in the 10 states that were still in rebellion in 1863, and thus did not cover the nearly 500,000 slaves in the slaveholding border states which were Union states. Those slaves were freed by later separate state and federal actions. The state of Tennessee had already mostly returned to Union control, under a recognized Union government, so it was not named and was exempted. Virginia was named, but exemptions were specified for the 48 counties then in the process of forming the new state of West Virginia, and 7 additional counties and 2 cities in the Union-controlled Tidewater region. Also specifically exempted were New Orleans and 13 named parishes of Louisiana, which were mostly under federal control at the time of the proclamation. These exemptions left unemancipated an additional 300,000 slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation has been ridiculed, notably in an influential passage by Richard Hofstadter for freeing only the slaves over which the Union had no power. These slaves were freed due to Lincoln's war powers. This act cleared up the issue of contraband slaves. It automatically clarified the status of over 100,000 now former slaves. Some 20,000 to 50,000 slaves were freed the day it went into effect in parts of 9 of the 10 states to which it applied. In every Confederate state, the proclamation went into immediate effect in Union-occupied areas, and at least 20,000 slaves were freed at once on January 1, 1863. Additionally, the proclamation provided the legal framework for the emancipation of nearly all 4 million slaves as the Union armies advanced, and committed the Union to ending slavery, which was a controversial decision even in the North. Hearing of the proclamation, more slaves quickly escaped to Union lines as the Army units moved south. As the Union armies advanced through the Confederacy, thousands of slaves were freed each day until nearly all were freed by July 1865. While the proclamation had freed most slaves as a war measure, it had not made slavery illegal. Of the states that were exempted from the proclamation, Maryland, Missouri, Tennessee, and West Virginia prohibited slavery before the war ended. In 1863, President Lincoln proposed a moderate plan for the reconstruction of the captured Confederate state of Louisiana. Only 10% of the state's electorate had to take the loyalty oath. The state was also required to abolish slavery in its new constitution. Identical Reconstruction plans would be adopted in Arkansas and Tennessee. By December 1864, the Lincoln Plan abolishing slavery had been enacted in Louisiana. However, in Delaware and Kentucky, slavery continued to be legal until December 18, 1865, when the 13th Amendment went into effect. Background: military action. Prior to emancipation, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required individuals to return runaway slaves to their owners. During the war, Union generals such as Benjamin Butler declared that slaves in occupied areas were contraband of war and accordingly refused to return them. This decision was controversial because it implied recognition of the Confederacy as a separate nation under international law, a notion that Lincoln steadfastly denied. As a result, he did not promote the contraband designation. Governmental action towards emancipation. In December 1861, Lincoln sent his first annual message to Congress. In it he praised the free labor system as respecting human rights over property rights. He endorsed legislation to address the status of contraband slaves and slaves in loyal states, possibly through buying the freedom with federal taxes, and also the funding of strictly voluntary colonization efforts. In January 1862, Thaddeus Stevens, the Republican leader in the House, called for total war against the rebellion to include emancipation of slaves, arguing that emancipation, by forcing the loss of enslaved labor, would ruin the rebel economy. On March 13, 1862, Congress approved a law enacting an additional article of war, which stated that from that point onward it was forbidden for Union Army officers to return fugitive slaves to their owners. On April 10, 1862, Congress declared that the federal government would compensate slave owners who freed their slaves. Slaves in the District of Columbia were freed on April 16, 1862, and their owners were compensated. On June 19, 1862, Congress prohibited slavery in all current and future United States territories, and President Lincoln quickly signed the legislation. By this act, they repudiated the 1857 opinion of the Supreme Court of the United States in the Dred Scott case that Congress was powerless to regulate slavery in U.S. territories. This joint action by Congress and President Lincoln also rejected the notion of popular sovereignty that had been advanced by Stephen A. Douglas as a solution to the slavery controversy. While completing the effort first legislatively proposed by Thomas Jefferson in 1784 to confine slavery within the borders of existing states, in July, Congress passed and Lincoln signed the Confiscation Act of 1862, containing provisions for court proceedings to liberate slaves held by convicted rebels, or of slaves of rebels that had escaped to Union lines. The act applied in cases of criminal convictions and to those who were slaves of disloyal masters. However, Lincoln's position continued to be that Congress lacked power to free all slaves within the borders of rebel-held states, but Lincoln as commander-in-chief could do so if he deemed it a proper military measure, and that Lincoln had already drafted plans to do. Public opinion of emancipation abolitionists had long been urging Lincoln to free all slaves. In the summer of 1862, Republican editor Horace Greeley of the highly influential New York Tribune wrote a famous editorial entitled "The Prayer of 20 Millions," demanding a more aggressive attack on the Confederacy and faster emancipation of the slaves. On the face of this wide earth, Mr. President, there is not one intelligent champion of the Union cause who does not feel that the rebellion, if crushed tomorrow, would be renewed if slavery were left in full vigor, and that every hour of deference to slavery is an hour of added and deepened peril to the Union. Lincoln responded in his letter to Horace Greeley, from August 22, 1862, in terms of the limits imposed by his duty as President to save the Union. If there be those who would not save the Union, unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery, and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union, and what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men, everywhere could be free. Lincoln scholar Harold Holzer wrote in this context about Lincoln's letter. Unknown to Greeley, Lincoln composed this after he had already drafted a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which he had determined to issue after the next Union military victory. Therefore, this letter was in truth an attempt to position the impending announcement in terms of saving the Union, not freeing slaves, as a humanitarian gesture. It was one of Lincoln's most skillful public relations efforts, even if it has cast long-standing doubt on his sincerity as a liberator. Historian Richard Schreiner argues that, for years, Lincoln's letter has been misreaders. Lincoln only wanted to save the Union. However, within the context of Lincoln's entire career and pronouncements on slavery, this interpretation is wrong, according to Schreiner. Rather, Lincoln was softening the strong northern white supremacist opposition to his imminent emancipation by tying it to the cause of the Union. This opposition would fight for the Union but not to end slavery, so Lincoln gave them the means and motivation to do both at the same time. In his 2014 book, Lincoln's Gamble, journalist and historian Todd Brewster asserted that Lincoln's desire to reassert the saving of the Union as his sole war goal was in fact crucial to his claim of legal authority for emancipation. Since slavery was protected by the Constitution, the only way that he could free the slaves was as a tactic of war, not as the mission itself. But that carried the risk that when the war ended, so would the justification for freeing the slaves. Late in 1862, Lincoln asked his Attorney General, Edward Bates, for an opinion as to whether slaves freed through a war-related proclamation of emancipation could be re-enslaved once the war was over. Bates had to work through the language of the Dred Scott decision to arrive at an answer, but he finally concluded that they could indeed remain free. Still, a complete end to slavery would require a constitutional amendment. Conflicting advice, to free all slaves, or not free them at all, was presented to Lincoln in public and private. Thomas Nast, a cartoon artist during the Civil War and the late 1800s, considered father of the American cartoon, composed many works including a two-sided spread that showed the transition from slavery into civilization after President Lincoln signed the proclamation. Nast believed in equal opportunity and equality for all people, including enslaved Africans or free blacks. A mass rally in Chicago on September 7, 1862, demanded an immediate and universal emancipation of slaves. A delegation headed by William W. Patton met the president at the White House on September 13. Lincoln had declared in peacetime that he had no constitutional authority to free the slaves. Even used as a war power, emancipation was a risky political act. Public opinion as a whole was against it. There would be strong opposition among Copperhead Democrats and an uncertain reaction from loyal border states. Delaware and Maryland already had a high percentage of free blacks, 91.2% and 49.7%, respectively, in 1860.